good to have you with us in the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate. Viewers, the Home Ministry has approved the plan to carry out a study to analyze radicalization in our country. The study will suggest practical solutions to prevent radicalization and indicate as to how the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act or UAPA can be used, can be amended. Now, here are the few basic pointers of what is it that the study is actually going to do. It's basically going to focus on the process of radicalization. Then it will suggest solutions indicating how UAPA can be amended. It will only be conducted in 4 specific states. 4 states have been chosen and highlighted, which is where this study will be conducted. The study will hopefully reveal vulnerable targets. It will, help in de-radicalisation. In fact, they will also be profiling and speaking to those linked to the radicalized individuals, and all of that will then be put together. Now, you heard just a short while ago the comments that we played out. Some of the opposition parties are already making a huge noise about it. The question arises, is the study on radicalization required? If it is indeed, are there any fears of which way it's going to be headed? For example, those who say it is required, that we need to legally define radicalization or perhaps have another law, or at least have some comprehensive information of why it's happening. What about the de-radicalization program? They say that in today's day and age, in digital media age, it is easier to influence people, to really spread your propaganda through social media and target the vulnerable. And of course, there's a global rise in the religious and ideological extremism which we're seeing, including in our country. But then on the other side, it is said that what if this is used only to target and victimize specific groups, minorities who end up getting harassed, or the governments actually use this study as proof or make a law only to lash out and target their critics and rivals. These are very basics. Let's get in our experts and get into a detailed conversation of if India really requires to legally define radicalization, if it already exists. Do we need a change in law? And if there are dangers and pitfalls about it being targeted only towards specific communities? Let's say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now. Ratan Shada, author and RSS member, joining us this evening. Mr. Siddharth Luthra, senior advocate. Also Arima Sundaram, senior advocate. Both of the Supreme Court join us this evening. I have Maya Meerchandani, Professor for Media Studies at the Ashoka University and Senior Fellow at the ORF, joining us this evening. But first up, good evening and thank you to all of you. But first up, I actually want to go across to Professor G.S. Bajpai. He's Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice System at, of course, the National Law University, and he will be part of this group. Thank you so much, Professor Bajpai.
Thank you so much.
As you shed more light on what this study intends to do, I will also ask you to answer one question that is on everybody's mind. Will this be religion or ideology agnostic?
Basically, let us understand that any issue that exists in the legal form or legal connotation has a sociological or social basis initially. Law comes much later. So any problem which is of social in nature, that tends to be criminalized for want of certain reasons. So decision to criminalize is, of course, rests with the state. But let us understand that what is it all about, that the study that you're talking. We are not really looking at something very unusual. The radicalization has been identified. First of all, let us understand there are cases in which we have understanding that hundreds of cases NIA has arrested. There is a different question that what is the radar or what are the tests that they have applied to assess the existence of radicalization. But what I say that radicalization is not connected to any particular group or particular ideology or particular religion. It's an ideology. It's about the ideas which can be of extremist nature and finally lead to violence, disturbance, any unlawful act. So basically, we are a law university, and I am a professor of law. we are governed by the rule of law. So anything which infringes the very tenets of the rule of law becomes the subject matter of law. So legal response to all such behavior which are unlawful in nature, which are detrimental to the constitutional value, which are against the rule of law framework need to be addressed. The concern is that though we discussed that the study on radicalization is required, but identification of radicalization is the first question which prompted me to undertake this study. It should not be left to the government at this stage what constitutes radicalization. This is the job of the expert to really understand and define what ought to be called radicalization. So it is in this context we have tried to define what is radicalization, what is de-radicalization, and what is the counter-radicalization, and what is anti-radicalization. And it's not the first time that it is happening in India. I tell you with a lot of conviction that the countries like Saudi Arabia and Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Philippines, all these countries have already brought a formal response to the issue of radicalization in this country, and they have been successful. So we had to create a legal regime which must be located within the framework of the rule of law without having any prejudice to any particular community. And I would say in the absence of this terminology, in the absence of this definition, the chances of injustice, the chances of arbitrary interpretations are much more pronounced. So if we are discussing this particular issue, it is in all fairness that we want a just understanding, because otherwise if you leave it to define the police, like UAPA amendments have been made 2 years ago. So the police has been given power to sort of declare somebody as a terrorist or something as terrorism.
Okay.
This kind of vague and arbitrary definitional, enterprise would ultimately result into a lot of arbitrariness on the part of police. So in the present study, we want to locate as to what are the factors responsible for radicalization, number one. Number two, we are inclined to identify that radicalization is not an incident, it is a process. It passes through a lot of stages. So can't we check these things at a pre-radicalized state to be able to prevent it? Third, we need to shun away the security-centric approach, which is typical police approach. We need to move on to reintegration, rehabilitation, and these kind. You cannot simply pick up somebody and take to the police because he has been, visiting certain website and lured by certain ideology and started undertaking something which is wrong in the eyes of the law. The
Okay.
need is to take this person and to sort of insert those influences which are positive in nature. So we are actually addressing the moot question that since we do not have a clear-cut policy, though in 2017 the Ministry of Home Affairs has set up a counter radicalization division in the Ministry of Home Affairs, but it has been set up without any policy basis, without any clear understanding of the phenomena of radicalization.
Okay.
So I think
Right.
the effort is required that we should identify, because we don't have any database. But we are getting some statistics from NIA, from other sources, that in many cases, youth particularly, youths are becoming vulnerable.
So,
So what is their response to radicalization?
So, Professor
Response
Bajpai,
to
let's take it step by step. You said this is largely to first help us identify and define radicalization. And then we go forward with a policy on how to deal with it, and of course a large part of it will be the de-radicalization part as well. Where does the UAPA come in? Mr. Arima Sundaram, immediately what we've seen as a response is, for people to pick up the current counterterrorism or anti-terrorism law and say we already have it, which targets people and terrorizes people. Will having a more exhaustive base and information actually help us tune it better and use it better?
Look, expressions like radicalization, terrorism, all these expressions are, you can make it into a very huge issue, complicated issue, and the whole question, what is radicalization exactly, what is terrorism exactly, can become very complicated issues. The point is, if you look at it, and I'm being very simple about it, very simplistic about it, there are basically four elements involved. In society, there are four elements involved. There is the influencer. The person who influences, wants to influence, is capable of influencing others. There is the influenced. The person who is willing to be influenced, who is capable of being influenced, and who by nature is one who is open to such influencing. Third is, what is the subject matter of the influencing? Is it something which could be pulling someone to your point of view, which you're entitled to have? Constitutionally, you have freedom of conscience. You're allowed to have your point of view. I pull someone to my point of view. I want them to behave in the manner I want them to behave. I have a right to do that. So the question is, what is the subject matter? Is the subject matter such that attacks the sovereignty and integrity of India? Now, that is a vital test. If it does not attack the sovereignty and integrity of India, or does not create hatred of one person to another or a community to another, which are otherwise already crimes, then that kind of influencing is on a different footing. And the fourth and most important, what is the means of this influencing? The means of the influencing today is the media. Is social media, our whole communication system is such that people are able to communicate not only thoughts, but they are able to communicate matters of implementing the thoughts, ideas of how to execute those thoughts, all in seconds and minutes. So it's a media and social media account. Now, if you take it that way, it becomes a very simple issue. The whole issue of radicalization is, are you and can be, and that's the only way it can be in any way constitutionally prevented. No one can prevent me from trying to influence another to my way of thinking. Nobody can do that, because if you did that, you've taken away from the very underlying structure of a democracy. You have created freedom of speech into a paper tiger. So nobody can prevent me from influencing someone unless I'm doing something illegal, which is already found in the Indian Penal Code, like creating communal disharmony, etc. Or what has now come up is this radicalization. So to put it very simply, unless I do something to incite people in some way against the sovereignty and integrity of India, if what I'm saying to people, if what I'm trying to convey, what I'm trying to convince them of, what I'm convincing them and showing them how to execute and how to act, if that is against the sovereignty and integrity of India, that basically is the radicalization we have to refer to, and no more.
Okay.
If you do anything more than that, you are then intruding clearly on free speech. So the UAPA, to that extent, today boasts of a lot of discretionary powers. You can't be discretionary about limiting freedom of expression. You have to be exact. And the way I look at it and the way I see radicalization is, anybody who's trying to move people, an individual or a mass or a group, to act in some way against the sovereignty and integrity of India is a person who I say is radicalizing. And if the penal code does not already provide for that, then perhaps you need an act for it.
Okay.
If the penal code already provides for it, then I don't see why you need an act for it. But what you can do is that there are levels of such radicalization. And for example, terrorism, to use arms, to use weapons, to use terroristic, so that you would punish far more stringently, and you'd have greater power to the police to prevent. But all in all, that is what I'm saying is radicalization. Anything which moves people, incites people, shows people how to act against the sovereignty and integrity of India. The rest is free speech. I have a right to get somebody to think.
So,
in
you
my
know,
way of
Mr.
thinking,
Sundaram,
or
you've
try to
said,
do so.
you've effectively answered what I was going to ask next, to say, well, who decides and how do you decide when somebody is being radicalized? You are saying it is when somebody is, believing or inciting someone to effectively wage a war against your country. And if that is what it is, Mr. Siddharth Luthra, then that's already defined in our laws. Then should we be bringing in anything new? That's how we define terrorism, waging a war against our country and its sovereign, and we already have a very controversial law for it.
Just to tell you, the law on terrorism is not new to the country. It's been here since 1984-85. And we've had it in various forms and shaped, but it's really the same law. I think what is important to understand is that there are two parts to dealing with crime. One is crime prosecution, which is the second stage. The earlier is crime prevention. I assume that the study on radicalization is looking at why people are marginalized and leading them to be radicalized. And that, in my view, is essential in understanding why certain categories of people take to crime. Of course, this must be community religious agnostic, but there has to be a study. And all over the world, in the Western world especially, there are statistics to see whether people of different color, race, religion are prone to greater prosecutions. That is, they're being brought within the ambit of the criminal justice system greater. If they are, so all societies, all civilized societies look at mechanisms to deal with this issue of marginalization. I must also point out, in 2011, India had joined a body called the Global Counterterrorism Forum. That Global Counterterrorism Forum, we were involved with them, and then it's not that active now. But the focus of that was looking at strategies for counterterrorism, and one of those strategies that was proposed was how to ensure that within the rule of law, we can ensure that people do not take to crime, and especially to terrorist crime. And that is something which is very crucial, because if we don't prevent crime, we're just prosecuting it and we're not meeting the core of the solution. I hope and I pray that Professor Bajpai, who's a very eminent academic and I have greatest regard for, will be looking at it from this perspective, but because this really needs study, and not only in UAPA, but across the board in a number of criminal laws.
Okay, I do have to go to Mr. Ratan Sharda and Maya Mirchadandi, but I would request you to just wait on for a bit because I think Professor Bajpai may want to respond to what both of our eminent lawyers have said right now.
Yeah, so I would first respond to Mr. Sundaram. Actually, we as a law person are never interested to bring any kind of suppression to the freedom of speech. This is unthinkable, out of question, not to be admitted at any cost. Actually, we are looking only to those extremist ideologies which become the important source and instigation to primary level of law and order disturbance. And also the term terrorism has been very well defined within the UAPA, and the content of that terrorism as an act is also very, very clear. We are only looking at, if I may say, that any process that through personal, electronic, or any other modes of communication results in exposure to and imbibing of a set of ideas by an individual or a group and devolves into the promotion of or manifest acts of unlawful activities. It is defined. Terrorism, it is defined. Violent extremism, it is defined. Offenses against the state, it is defined. And offenses against public tranquility or increases the likelihood thereof. This is the definition which we are contemplating. It is all encompassing. It is nowhere that merely criticizing the state or having a different viewpoint. I fully agree to Mr. Siddharth Luthra. Actually, this is the essence that I was trying to convey, which he has very clearly brought out, that our criminal justice system has lately become very, very reactive and retributive, not leaving any space to the marginalized people, those who are poor. And we cannot really, justice for us has become the disposal of cases. Disposal of cases is not the justice. Our system is not at all preventive. So when we discuss the process of radicalization, means we are trying to search the solution where the people can be prevented at an early stage through positive intervention, not police intervention. And positive interventions with a meaning to integrate them with the society, maybe in terms of promoting them into education, employment, and other kinds of rehabilitative and reintegrative methodologies. So it's preventive and it is reductionist in approach. It is not reactive or punitive or retributive. So question of targeting marginalized, and therefore but we are discussing the matter of laying down the standard so that while police using the UAPA Act or any other act not in a position to arbitrarily decide that the person is in the process of radicalization or has radicalized. So this thing has to be very clearly understood, because at the moment this entire debate is punctuated by opinions. I
Yes,
am talking across the country. But
right.
now we need to move on to facts.
Okay,
So
let's
this is
also say
about facts.
opinions, also apprehensions,
Yes, yes. Yes, yes.
and presumptions or fears about where it might go. But Maya Mirchandani, to what Professor Bajpayee is saying, if this is an effort to stop the process and more precautionary and reaction before people get radicalized, then are there any international examples of where and how it's been successfully done? India has not seen the kind of extremism, in fact, that many of the other countries actually have.
Yes, but I'll answer that part of your question later. On the issue of the international agreements, I mean, the whole idea of trying to understand radicalization and the drivers of radicalization comes under the umbrella of what the UN termed a few years ago, attempts to counter and prevent violent extremism. And the decision to use the terminology of violent extremism as opposed to the terminology of terrorism was a careful one, because terrorism in the years since 9/11 has also resulted in the kind of Islamophobia that many countries are tackling. And, extremism was considered to be an all-encompassing term. And I think the same goes for India. I mean, we're talking about the UAPA now, but if we look at the UAPA, India's own definitions of terrorism are four. They're ethno-national, they are religious, they are left-wing extremism, and they are narco-terrorism. These are the categories of terrorism we have. I mean, of course, I'm not talking about the amendment, which suddenly now talks about individuals as opposed to groups. But, up until recently, the UAPA was applicable to groups and members with group affiliations. Radicalization, on the other hand, is the process by which somebody decides to subscribe to a belief system, radical thinking, ideology, and act violently on behalf of that ideology. That definition already sort of exists. I think what Professor Bajpayee is trying to do, and as somebody who studies this, I welcome this, because I think what we need in India right now is to understand what the drivers of radicalization are. When we talk about prevention, we're talking about drivers. Now, there are two sets of drivers. There are push factors, there are pull factors. Something that pushes somebody who's been influenced on the path of radicalization, or somebody that pulls them towards it. And I think in the case of groups like ISIS and Daesh, a lot of it was about the pull factors, the glory of fighting jihad, the gizmos with which ISIS was creating these videos, trying to get people to subscribe to its faith and ideology online. That's one part of it. But I think when it comes to push factors and pull factors, the idea that radicalized violence, radical violence, extremist violence, and terrorist violence need to be looked at in a neutral manner, a religion neutral manner. And I really hope that something like this is, Professor Bajpayee is committing to making it a faith neutral exercise. And I really hope, for India's sake and for a global example that we'd like to set, that that is what would be achieved. Because I think we really need to be careful on this path that we tread. We're looking at global conversations right now on changing contours and definitions of extremism. And in this sort of post-ISIS landscape, where you have disparate jihadi violence and you have right-wing extremism, white supremacist violence, etc., there are many, many aspects to understanding these drivers. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that those drivers are based in social interaction, in community behavior, in education, in government policy, and global policy. So when we are defining radicalization, can we put everything on the table? I think that's really the question I have for this exercise.
Okay, Professor Bajpayee, before I get an answer from you, let me just quickly get in a comment from Mr. Ratan Sharda as well. Mr. Ratan Sharda, do we really have to, ask this question that this could lead to a one aspect, one religion focused kind of a policy or a study, that this could be more about Islamophobia than anything else? Several people have raised the question, why is it happening only in these specific states? A study will be conducted in Kashmir, in Kerala, in Assam, and Maharashtra, 4 of the states where we have seen a lot more cases of actually people who've been accused of being influenced and being a part of Islamic State.
See, first of all, I must say that I welcome this step to have this kind of committee which will get into the issues of radicalization, preventive steps, and what can be done when it happens, or de-radicalization. Coming to the other points, Professor Vajpayee suddenly expanded the entire debate into the justice delivery. He talked about long years of cases who are not getting justice. So this is another aspect which will not be covered, I think, in this particular study, because then you're expanding the scope of entire justice delivery system. I would welcome it. I would rather say that if this study goes into entire justice delivery system where poor people rot in the jail for 20 or 25 years on some petty crime because they cannot raise the bail money, because they cannot have good lawyers, or whatever reason, we need to look into people who are put into lockups for days together without any charge sheet, without any going to the court. They are there, just there. I know cases where people are sitting in the lockup for 7 days without even going to the courts. So this is what is the major issue, which if this committee wants to tackle, fine. Now coming to the radicalized issue, I think we have a very poor habit of creating every issue into a political discourse, political discussion. This issue of radicalization, can you deny that there is radicalization happening? And I would say, why just religious radicalization? Why not Naxal radicalization? Why it is not included? Why GNU is not included? Why Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh are not included? Is Naxalism not radicalization? It is much more serious radicalization. I think the scope has to be increased. And every country has done academic study. We have not done. We have some left, completely left Naxal mice kind of delivery where you can keep on saying RSS, BJP are communal, they are fascists without even defining it. And somebody will say anti-national terrorist people without even defining it. Definition is important, and this kind of one-sided narrative of who is what has to be clearly, objectively defined. And if you say Islamophobia, what about Hinduphobia? Is there no Hinduphobia? Entire way that Hindus are being slammed across within India, outside India, has also been addressed. And whether this particular radical view leads to violence, was there any? See, India had the lowest radicalization, as everybody admitted, during the earlier years. Now it is slowly increasing. Why is it increasing? Because the sense of victimhood being created, the sense of glamour, as Baya rightly pointed out about ISIS, etc., has driven people to that extreme step, which is not correct. So if there is a reason, where is a religious reason, where is political reason, this to be identified. In Kashmir, military has time and again proven that when it goes for the human approach to the same people, they surrender, they join the mainstream. Dacoits in the Madhya Pradesh earlier did the same thing. But point is there is no consistency in approach. We have continuously dilly-dallying in case of Naxals, in case of Jammu Kashmir. There is no consistent policy. So if you can define these studies, if you can define these various parameters of how a particular issues are to be tackled, then maybe the governments of whichever shade as they come will have a much more clearer policy than what is being currently being simply by who is the IS officer looking after it, who is the minister looking after it, and suddenly you have a lean period for Naxals, a strong action against Naxals. Same thing happens in Kashmir. You have very straight action against the terrorists, then suddenly start releasing terrorists. So this approach has to change. So this is important. As far as UAPA is concerned, I would imagine that UAPA can be made more humane. Okay. It can be made more controlled, where police is not able to use it for its own purposes, where it can exploit a person or create havoc with a personal life, whether it's any religion, any ideology. So if we are able to create more objectivity in this particular case, more clarity, crystallization, where no person bereft of any ideology is harassed or oppressed or violated against by the same police who is supposed to protect the law. So if these are the parameters, this study is welcome, but there are some issues which can be added in the scope. There are some issues which can be more crystallized rather than going by what is wordly expected definitions of various things.
Okay, I know, Maya.
UK had de-radicalization issue. See, UK had de-radicalization program, it failed. Because if you don't name the elephant in the room, there is going to be a problem. So if this committee is able to name the elephant in the room and they're able to find that what exactly is happening in the society, and who are the trouble, who are the, I can say, who push the button to create these situations, then we'll have a very good answer to the coming years.
Okay, I know Maya Mirchandani wants to make a point, but Professor Bajpai, would you want to just first quickly clarify on the scope of the study, and if it does include, fixing the judicial aspect of it?
No, actually, see, when we do a scientific study, it has definite boundaries. It cannot be, universally carried out in all places. I understand that there may be instances in so many places where this study can be located, but we have chosen these states for the purpose of, identification of those instances where we can collect some data. But definitely, we are thinking the suggestion given by Mr. Sharda is very important. That the left-wing extremist terrorism is also one of the forms where the instances of radicalization are happening. Let's see when the study proceeds. We'll try to get our sample frame little more inclusive in terms of incorporating a more diverse sample. But what I'm trying to say that, look, what happens, as he has very rightly pointed out, people have apprehension about, particular targeting. See, what happens when law operates, it doesn't discriminate because law is very neutral. It has to be value neutral. Actually, the people behind the law may have problems, but law in itself is not a
People
problem.
using the law may not necessarily be neutral.
Yes, that is the problem. But I am telling you, as far as the notion of rule of law is concerned, it is neutral in its foundation, in its conceptualization. What I am saying that when we proceed with this kind of process, it may be that a particular religious group may be found more and more, the instances. So it is the fact. We cannot say anything. There is a couplet in Urdu that मैं आईना हूँ मेरी अपनी जवाबदारी है जिसको कबूल ना हो वो सामने से हट जाए. So Aina has to show what is happening. So we are on facts. We are not on selective facts.
Okay.
We are on, facts which are randomly collected, and we will try to build up. That's what I'm saying. We need to create certain standards, and law is one standard. So we need to address this problem ultimately through legal solutions. And what are the legal? But as he has rightly pointed out, we need to make UAPA more preventive, more human, more justice-centric, rather than more security-centric.
Well, may I just say this, and I'm glad that I think almost every panelist here does agree that we need to make a few changes to the UAPA Act, definitely. And I think everybody agrees to that aspect. We'll see how that happens. So yes, Maya Mirchandani, to you, before I go back to our lawyers.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I've been spending the last 3 or 4 years researching what CVE is globally, what radicalization processes are globally, how we can apply global standards to India, etc. And I don't like it when people cherry pick things that I say from my conversation. Yes, I did talk about what ISIS was doing as an example of the methods of radicalization. Those methods are being used globally by right-wing extremists. They're being used by white supremacists. The threat landscape, especially online, has become far more diffuse. People are preying on all kinds of grievances. And just to come to your point about the 4 states, I do find that extremely problematic for the simple reason, while they may have had the most number of people from these states go abroad and join, ISIS fighters in Syria and Iraq or Afghanistan or what have you. The fact is, globally, all over the world, India is seen as a success story when it comes to ISIS radicalization. It really upsets me that we in India don't see ourselves as that success story. We have 170 Indians who have joined these groups in however many years, compared to thousands of Europeans, hundreds of Americans,
Correct.
and again, thousands of people from the Middle East. So why is it that 170 number is not being seen as a success story for the fact that, let's not talk about only one community. Radicalization, the process of radicalization.
Okay, but let me ask you this then.
Someone is influenced and takes up a cause with violence. that doesn't have to be religion specific.
But let me
So, I
ask
mean,
you
let's
this
not-
then.
let's
I
not-
agree with you, and which is why I said, in comparison to other countries, we haven't seen that kind of extremism or
No, and not just
radicalization.
that, we are
But,
actually
Maya
very
Mirchandani, we
territorial.
also haven't seen an equal amount of right-wing extremism, so to say, on official cases, or white supremacy, or any other kinds of violent extremism the rest of the world is witnessing. So for us, this does become a bigger problem then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the fact is that we have not seen the kinds of numbers that people abroad are talking about. We don't have the kinds of right to bear arms that Western countries may have. So, that violence hasn't spilled out onto the streets. And so the numbers we're talking about for a country of, 130 crore people is extremely small. So, let's not focus on this. If we're talking about radicalization, everything around us, I mean, you're a journalist, I'm a journalist. The study of semiotics is how culture appropriates signs and symbols and verbal and non-verbal cues. Look at the kind of radicalization that's taking place around us. Can we arrest those drivers? Can we start with that?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, Mr. Sudat Luthra. To you first, and then Arima Sundaram. Yes, Mr. Luthra.
Just one small point, if you allow me.
I think it's, if I may, Mr. Sharda, I think it's very important that we study the law, its application and preventive measures. Unfortunately, in India, we have failed to do enough research and analysis, and our statistics and numbers are one thing. Yes, they've chosen 4 states. They may increase those states. They may increase the ambit. And I agree with Maya Mirchandani, where she rightly said that you can't just focus on one element, and you must look at the issues at a larger plane. And without cherry picking on what she's saying, but the point is, research and analysis is important for an understanding of the application and the improvements of the changes in the law. I'm glad at least that somebody has decided to do some research. We don't know what will come out of it, but the fact of the research itself is the first positive step. And if people can't see that, that's unfortunate. Yes, it can be tweaked, it can be modified, it can be expanded or varied, but that research will inform us as a society, and only then can we go and improve our commitment to the rule of law.
Okay, but if it is to be focused only on 4 states, Mr. Arima Sundaram, which is the concern, and I'm raising it again because many people have asked about this. If it is only going to be in Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala, Assam and Maharashtra, then is there a fear that it would only end up having a limited research and sample of what's going wrong?
Naturally, if you have very few states from where you're surveying, then the scope of your research will be limited. But let's come down to the real issue here, Tanvi. The issue here is that in India, we have more statutes pouring out of our ears than you have in any other country. You have an act to take care of every single thing. You have an act to take care of whether it's to do with atrocities to people of a different community or not. You have acts to take care of terrorism. You have acts to take care of everything. So if you look at it, we have the acts already. The acts are in place. This is really, the way I look at this study is, it's a sociological study. It is not a legal study. It is a sociological study. Why? It's a sociological study to see who are the people who are getting influenced by people who are capable of influencing them to very extreme measures which are against the very constitution of our country. How do we see to it that these people do not get influenced while still keeping in view the larger framework of the right of freedom of speech and expression, and while also recognizing that the 4th estate is never going to crumble and the 4th estate will always be used, the media, the social media especially today will be used. So I see it as a sociological study to see what are the causes of people getting so influenced by radical thoughts which are anti-constitutional and then getting motivated to act against the constitution in that way. And equally, how do we curb such people from being able to influence others and from spreading such thoughts through the media? Now, that is the scope of the study, the way I see it.
Okay.
The act as it stands is very clear. There are enough acts and more.
Yeah.
We may use the word radical, we may use the word terrorism, we may use any other word. But in India, let me assure you, if anybody in any way acts against the constitution, acts against the rule of law, there are already statutes, there are already enactments to deal with it. What perhaps is required is that through this sociological study, we can be more exact in our definitions and more clear in our definitions in those statutes.
Okay, I just want
And therefore,
to say,
I
though,
feel a wider study is much more important.
I just want to say, though, it pained me a little, Mr. Arima Sundaram, when you said social media in the same sentence as the fourth estate. But I do understand that some part of it, we may be ourselves to blame the way things have become now. That being said, Mr. Ratan Chadha, you wanted to come in and make a point. Go ahead, please.
Just wanted to, one small point I wanted to make. It was that when you create laws, when you create something based on bias and on base of political thinking, then you get a bill like Communal Violence Bill, which was piloted by UPA, which put the entire onus of any riot, any kind of violence on the majority community without any study, without any analysis, without even putting up before the law was brought into the parliament, that was dropped finally. So that is why this study is very important. That it should not be just based on biases, on impressions, and what people think, a few people think. That is the reason I said this study is very important. I pointed out this particular law because this was most draconian, most accusatory kind of law that could be made, which has never been discussed again. So that is why I brought this out. What is the reason for this kind of study and why we should welcome it, whatever the outcome. For the first time, there is a political establishment ready to look at the very roots of the issue and come up with a solution. So we should welcome it, rather than just politicize everything.
Well, may I just also point out there was a reason that we actually didn't bring in the political representatives,
Tanvi, can I just say one thing?
Ruling party, because
Tanvi,
I wanted this to be a conversation between experts. Yes, Mr. Sundaram.
Tanvi, you very correctly brought out the difference between the media and social media, as media being the fourth estate. Let me make one thing very clear to you. Whether you like to accept it or not today, even the media gives very extreme thoughts on different aspects, which equally are influencing or even more so.
Yeah.
So that is why I said any form of communication is capable of doing it.
Oh yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you. That's why I said, we are to be blamed to a certain extent as well. Some from the same industry, yes. A case, and a specific case of that was debated very exhaustively in Supreme Court in the last few weeks. Professor Bajpai, you wanted to respond to some of the points that have been made.
Yeah, so actually, I was just trying to say that the final outcome that we are intending to derive from this study is to have a national action plan to combat radicalization. We have done a small case study of Maharashtra experience. Maharashtra ATS has claimed to have de-radicalized as many as 150 or so people. Of course, they have a method which we have studied. And we think that this is more of a method. This is a job of psychologists. So when a wrong impression can be perpetuated and people can be brainwashed, there could be positive methods and positive psychology which can, help them doing away with those kinds of influences which young person tend to undergo on account of the kind of. So will you believe that there are more than 500 websites who are recruiting the people into radicalization, and people are systematically undergoing radicalization that needs to be cracked with matching response. And what is the matching response? You cannot do the hardcore policing here. You need to bring your paraphernalia. So what I am talking about, what is the de-radicalization infrastructure that we have? We need to create a de-radicalization infrastructure which would consist of a team of people who are rich in soft skills. They may be, even religious leaders who are neutral, who can, like sometimes the religious, tenets from Bible, Quran, they are misinterpreted or, mistaught to the, people. So there should be someone who can give the right meaning, the correct perspective. These things are very important parts and parcel of a program. So we need to develop a module. If there is a radicalization module, there could be a de-radicalization module as well. So
should that be a big focus, Mayamir Chandani? Because, and while I was researching and preparing for this conversation, I actually came across one example from July 2020 where Saadi Anwar Sheikh, who was nabbed by the NIA and accused of being an ISIS asset, had actually in the past been officially de-radicalized twice. Clearly that didn't work. Do we need to focus more on that?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, methods to de-radicalize, of course, we need to focus. And I think the NIA will sort of bear testimony to this, that in many instances, families of those who have gone abroad have actually stepped in to say, help us bring these people back. We don't know what they're doing. The family unit is an important factor in sort of assessing de-radicalization. And bear in mind, I say this very carefully because all of us today are living in digitally isolated worlds. We don't know what our own family members are doing on their screens in another room. So that first breakdown has happened actually within the home, where people don't know what you're consuming on your device or your computer. And I think it starts from there. There are many mechanisms. I mean, somebody talked about religious elders, community leaders, community policing, a neighborhood network, schools and colleges, recreation, all kinds of methods that globally are being used in de-radicalization processes. Sure, there will be one or two cases in which it doesn't work, but there are many cases in which it has worked, and you don't hear about them. You only tend to hear about the one failure that may have taken place. But for each failure, there are many success stories, and I think that's what we have to hold on to, because I do agree that there is a need to understand what these drivers of radicalization are. And I think that's what Professor Bajpai seems to indicate is going to be the focus of their work, the analysis, the research, to understand it is a psychological, a sociological, a cultural, an economic, a political phenomenon all rolled into one. This cannot function in a silo. So if we are going to tackle it, we need to do it comprehensively.
Okay, on that note, I was going to wrap, but Mr. Ratan Sharda wanted to make a point. Go ahead, please.
Very small point.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that we cannot go by what globally people have studied or seen.
Correct.
One of the reasons why India has low radicalization, since you already named ISI as one of the elephants, is because India has a different cultural viewpoint. It has a different cultural set. It has different kind of values. Even the Muslims of India, because they come from the same culture, they have different value system. That is one of the reasons. So unless we recognize the strength of our culture and why radicalization can be controlled, we will be getting into a Western model, which is much more younger, much more radicalized in the sense extreme views, whether it's Christian or Islamic or left or right, whatever it is. In India, it's not so. We are always moderates. We have a capacity to absorb people's viewpoints and move ahead. So if we keep that in mind, we keep our Indian perspective in mind, we will be much more successful in finding solutions.
Okay, there is merit to what you're saying in terms of, us being the moderates and the cultural aspect, but I do want to add to it that many of the other countries in the world also perhaps took it too lightly for way too long. And if you don't fix the grassroots problems for why people may feel disgruntled or lost and will become easy targets, excluded, and then they become easy targets for people who want to radicalize or use you for their own purposes. And if you don't respond to that right away or pinpoint that problem on time, then it does end up becoming a bigger problem. So which is why I believe that it is the right time to at least conduct a study, an all-encompassing study that looks into the various reasons, the kinds of extremism that we are witnessing in our country, the reasons for that, and how do we go about stopping it or fixing it, including de-radicalization. A big thank you to all of our panelists, and a special thank you to, in fact, Professor Bajpai for staying with us through this conversation and taking all of our questions and all of our queries and doubts as well. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us on this conversation. Viewers, here is what I need to say. I think we need to stop tiptoeing around certain issues, and we need to stop jumping the gun. Yes, we flagged off the crucial fears and concerns, and they remain. But the concerns are more about how any data, any research, any law, or any policy is actually used by those in power. It's not about the facts on ground. It's not about to say what's really visible there and what's happening in our country and why it's happening. That must be done, and that must be found out, that must be said. But once that is done, what do you do with that information? Do you use that information selectively and design laws in a way that can only be beneficial to one side? Do you design your laws in a neutral way, but the law enforcers and the lawmakers use it in a biased way? That's the difference here. There is no harm in having a research done as to why some people in our country may be falling prey to those who want to put the idea of violence and extremism and hatred and radicalize our minds. But there is a problem if the government, if the legal machinery, if the judicial machinery only uses this study, this information, the laws that we have to target a specific group of people. That's the difference. One can only hope that what Professor Bajpai and his team will be looking into will be an all-encompassing study, including all communities, all groups, and all kinds of ideologies leading to extremism. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.